The horse limped the last mile. Snow whispered at the edges of the timber line, not falling yet but threatening in the stillness. Gray light folded over the mountains like a tired quilt, and the wind carried the bitter scent of pine smoke. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and clicked her tongue to urge the mare forward, though the beast's breath came in soft, ragged plumes. The saddle creaked beneath her, stiff with ice. Her name was Josie. No one called her that anymore. Not since the prairie swallowed her husband 3 winters back, and she buried a child beneath stones too small to carry a name. Folks in the last town had called her the widow with the scar, though they never dared say it to her face. She'd left before dawn, headed west without promise or plan, only a need to be gone from everything that remembered. She spotted the cabin just before dusk. It sat low in the draw, half hidden by a crooked stand of birch, smoke curling from the chimney like it was trying not to be seen. No fence, no dog barking, just a split-rail porch, a red axe sunk in a stump, and a single light flickering behind a curtain. Josie dismounted stiffly, boots crunching on frost-hardened ground, her mare bent to sniff the snow-patched grass. Josie let her, too tired to tether her just yet. She stepped onto the porch and rapped once on the door with a cold-knuckled fist. It opened slow. The man on the other side filled the doorway like he'd grown from the floorboards. He wore a canvas shirt, open at the throat despite the cold, and his eyes were a gray that didn't blink right away. A knife glinted on his belt, but his hands were empty. The light behind him was from a lantern on a nail. Josie said, "My horse is lame. I'll go when she's rested." He looked past her, at the mare, at the gathering dark. She thought he might shut the door. Instead, he stepped aside. She crossed the threshold and stood just inside. The warmth hit her with a sudden shame. She smelled stew and ash and something faintly medicinal. The room held little beyond a stove, a table, a cot against the wall, tools hung where a woman might once have put pictures. No sign of another soul. "You can sleep there," he said, nodding at a second cot she hadn't noticed. "There's oats for the mare, I'll see to her." Josie watched him pull on a coat and disappear into the dusk, his steps firm, unhurried. She hadn't told him her name. He hadn't asked. When he returned, his beard was crusted with frost. He handed her a tin cup with something that stung her throat in a way that felt nearly like comfort. They didn't speak again that night. She lay on the cot staring at the rough-hewn beams, listening to the soft breath of the fire, the occasional creak of wood settling against the cold. Outside, the wind shifted. By morning, the snow had come. Thick, silent drifts blanketed the world. Her mare stood in the lean-to with her leg tucked wrong, and the road was gone. Josie looked out at the white-berried hills and felt a weight settle into her bones. Not fear, not exactly. More like a memory she hadn't known she carried. The man didn't say a word, just handed her a second cup of that sharp, bitter drink and split more wood than one body ought to need. His name, she learned 3 days later, was Elias. She meant to stay one night. But by the time the third storm passed, and the mare could bear her weight again, she wasn't sure why she hadn't saddled up. The road was passable then. He didn't stop her. But he didn't ask her to leave. And that was the beginning of it. The snow stayed longer than it ought to. That was the first excuse. A week passed, maybe 10 days. Time settled thick as the drifts against the doorframe, and Josie stopped counting mornings. She rose with the light, helped stack kindling, cleaned the iron pot when Elias finished cooking. They moved around each other quiet, like 2 deer sharing a trail, watchful, not unkind. She learned the layout of the land through the window panes, a stream frozen glass clear, a trail of rabbit prints looping through the brush, the twin humps of a ridge he called Fox's Back. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it landed with the weight of someone unused to wasting breath. When Josie told him her mare's name, Bramble, he just nodded, like maybe he'd already guessed it. Elias had scars too, not the kind that show first. He had a long-heeled break in his left hand, a ridge of bone that made him grip his cup funny. Sometimes in sleep he flinched, small, sharp movements that didn't belong in someone that solid. He didn't dream out loud, and she didn't ask. One afternoon she followed him to the trapline. He offered her a second pair of snowshoes, worn but serviceable, and didn't slow his pace when she strapped them on. The trail cut through a narrow gulch where the wind bit hard and mean. They moved single file. She watched how his shoulders bent against the cold, how his breath fogged and vanished. They caught 2 hares and a pine marten. He cleaned them with practiced, merciless hands. Josie didn't flinch, only wrapped the meat in her scarf. Blood steamed in the snow. That night he left the cabin door cracked, and a red fox nosed its way near. They watched it together through the glass. Neither spoke. She told him about her child the next morning. It was simple, unceremonious. She was sewing a torn mitten by the stove, and he was mending the broken hinge on the root cellar door. She said, "She died in spring, just after the thaw. Her name was Leila." Elias kept working. His hammer never paused. But when he stood, he came to her, knelt beside the chair, and took the scrap of wool from her lap. He finished the stitching with care, like it mattered. After that, something shifted. They shared silence not as strangers, but as co-conspirators in grief. He told her how the cabin had been his brother. There was no grave, just a rock pile halfway up the hill, one boot sunk beside it. Indian raid, he said, nothing left but bone. Winter bore down harder, and the chimney smoked sometimes when the wind turned from the north. They slept in the same room but never touched. Still, Josie felt the pull of him, not in her body first, but in the way she moved, how she waited to hear his step before opening the door, how she left her gloves by his instead of on her cot. He started making coffee for 2. One night in the blue hush before dawn, Bramble let out a low, uneasy snort. Josie woke instantly. Elias was already standing, gun in hand, bare feet planted wide. The knock came again, soft but certain, not the wind. A woman stood on the porch, wrapped in a man's coat, hair loose, eyes hollow. Behind her, a boy clung to her skirt, barefoot in the snow. She said, "He's sick, please." Josie stepped forward before Elias could speak, pulled the child into the warmth, wrapped him in her own blanket. His skin burned under her fingers. The woman collapsed into the chair by the stove and wept without sound. Elias only said, "We'll need more firewood." The boy's name was Matthew. He had fever, shaking spells, a cough that rattled low and mean. Josie dosed him with willow bark and broth. She held his hand when he slept. The woman Anna slept little, eyes always on her son, never quite on Josie. Elias built a second cot, didn't say whose it was. And still the snow fell. The child's fever broke on the 12th night. Josie had been holding his wrist, counting the pulse with eyes sore from wakefulness. When she felt the shift, his brow cooled, his breath steadied. A sigh escaped her lips before she knew it, soft as prayer. Anna, curled tight on the floor beside him, heard the sound and opened her eyes. For the first time, there was a glint of hope in them, raw and unsteady. The next morning, Elias brought in a bundle of dry birch limbs and set them beside the stove. He didn't look at the boy, but his movements were gentler than usual. He laid a tin cup by Anna's side without speaking. She nodded, cradling it in both hands like a blessing. Outside, a crust of ice had settled over the snow. It sparkled mean in the light wind hissing across the ridges. The world was still frozen, but life within the cabin stirred, fragile, persistent. Anna stayed quiet, her presence like a shadow cast by old sorrow. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer stories. Josie sensed something fractured behind her silences, something more than mere fear. At night, Josie heard her whispering to the boy, words too soft to catch. Sometimes she cried, barely audible beneath the crackling logs. Elias built a new shelf for the root cellar. Josie helped sand the wood, her fingers stiff in the cold. He glanced at her once, and something passed between them, not a smile, not quite, but an easing, a shared breath. He said, "You know you could have left, before the storm." She met his eyes, "I know." The days lengthened by a heartbeat. Josie took to walking the ridge when the sun allowed, her boots biting through the crusted snow. She saw fox tracks again, and once the sweep of wings low over the valley, an owl hunting early. The wind whispered things she hadn't dared listen for in years. Things like maybe you're not just surviving, maybe you're healing. One afternoon, while Josie was splitting kindling near the porch, Anna came outside. Her eyes were rimmed red, and she held a bundle in her arms. A coat, threadbare but carefully folded. She held it out to Josie. "It was my husband," she said. "He's not coming back. I thought you might. It's warm." Josie took it without speaking. Her fingers brushed Anna, and in that instant, something shifted, an understanding forged not in words but in shared ache, grief recognizing its own shape. That night they all sat together near the fire. Elias sharpened a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. Josie mended a ripped hem. Anna held Matthew as he slept, her hand stroking his hair. Elias looked up once and said, "Spring will come late this year." Josie answered, "That's all right." Later, when the others were asleep, Josie lay awake on her cot and listened to the hush of the room. Elias sat near the window, his back to her, the faint glow of the fire painting his shoulders gold. She didn't call out, didn't need to. She watched the outline of him, how still he held himself, as if waiting for something he didn't dare expect. She knew that feeling. And she knew something else, too. He still hadn't asked her to leave. The thaw came not with warmth, but with sound. Drips began to fall from the eaves, slow and rhythmic. Icicles broke loose from the rafters and shattered like glass in the yard. The snow didn't melt all at once. It shrank, curled in on itself, hardened to crusty remnants that clung to the north side of trees. But the silence changed. The hush of deep winter gave way to a low murmur, the creek stirring beneath its ice, branches creaking as sap returned to their veins. Inside, the cabin held its own thaw. Matthew took to his feet again, leaner but bright-eyed. He followed Elias outside each morning now, his thin voice asking steady questions about traps and firewood, the names of trees, the way to tell fox tracks from coyote. Elias answered them all without pause, like he had always been waiting for a boy to listen. Anna grew stronger too. She swept the hearth without being asked, mended what could be mended. She still said little, but there was color in her cheeks again, and her eyes no longer flinched from the light. Josie spent more time beyond the cabin walls. She ventured down to the creek's edge where moss peeked from under wet stone. She knelt once, pressed her hand to the thawing earth, and felt it pulse beneath her palm like a living thing. She hadn't prayed since Leela, but that moment came close. One morning, Elias handed her a small bundle wrapped in canvas. "For you," he said. She opened it to find a carving knife, its handle smooth and worn, the blade newly honed. "Figured you might want something of your own," he said, not meeting her eyes. She nodded once, throat thick, "Thank you." They spoke more now, not much, but enough. He told her about the trapper who taught him everything after his brother died, how the man had walked out one spring and never returned. Josie spoke of her first home back east, of the piano her mother played, and how she'd hated the sound of it as a child, of how she missed it now. One dusk, as shadows stretched long across the ridgeline, Josie stood by the stump where the axe rested. She looked up and saw Elias at the doorway, watching her. His face held that same unreadable quiet, but his eyes held steady on hers. There was something waiting there, something that had grown slowly, patiently, like sap rising beneath bark. He said, "The boy wants to learn to fish. Come thaw, I thought we might take him down river." She felt something soften inside her chest, a bud, tentative but alive. "You ever fished, Elias?" she asked. "Badly," he admitted. She smiled, first time in a while it reached her eyes. "Then I'll teach you both." Later that night, she found herself lingering near the fire after the others had gone to bed. Elias was at the table, working on a new snare. She sat across from him, their hands close on the wood, the silence easy. "I should leave," she said quietly. Not a threat, not a plea, just truth. He nodded once slowly, "But you haven't." "No." They looked at each other then, not as strangers caught by storm or need, but as something steadier, two people shaped by hardship, held together not by rescue, but by recognition. "You can if you want," he said, "when the road's clear." Josie held his gaze, "And if I don't want?" He didn't smile, didn't look away. "Then you don't." She said nothing else, just reached out, laid her hand on the table beside his, not touching, not yet, but close. Outside, the snow kept melting. Spring rose slow through the valley. First came the crocus, bruising purple through the frostbitten grass. Then the creek, its surface cracked and restless, began to sing again. Trees budded soft at their tips, and the scent of thawed loam filled the air like a promise. Mud clung to boots. Birds returned in pairs. Josie stayed. She didn't speak it, not aloud. There was no grand moment, no declaration in the doorway, no trail turned back upon. She simply began to plant roots in the quiet, invisible ways. Her coat hung next to his, her knife resting beside his on the shelf, her voice calling Matthew in from the trees when dusk fell low. She built a garden plot beside the cabin, dug the frozen ground with stubborn hands. Elias watched her, then joined without a word, turning the earth while she planted wild onion, sweetroot, the dried beans she'd bartered for last summer and never found cause to sow. Anna helped too sometimes, her eyes clearer now, her hands steadier. The boy grew louder. He chased moths in the sunlight, swung a stick like it was a rifle, laughed without fear. One day he asked if Elias had ever had a son. The man looked at Josie before answering. No, he said, not by blood. Josie started sleeping near the fire beside Elias. At first, they didn't touch, just shared warmth and breath. But one night when the wind returned sharp from the peaks, he reached for her. Not urgently, not with hunger, just a hand on her shoulder, a weight she leaned into. She touched his jaw, rough with days of stubble, and felt the tension leave his frame like a thawed river breaking loose. In the hush that followed, he whispered, "You don't have to be alone in it anymore." She didn't cry. She only held on, as steady and quiet as the woman she'd become. By May, the road out was passable again. Traders came through with horses and news, laughter and talk of distant towns. One offered Josie coin for her mare. Another said a man downriver was looking for a midwife. Anna looked tempted, but Josie only nodded politely and turned away. Bramble whickered from the paddock. The road didn't call her any more. One evening, she walked the ridge alone. The valley unfurled below, green and vast. Smoke curled from the chimney. She saw Elias in the field, mending fence with Matthew hauling nails in a tin pail behind him. Anna stood at the water barrel, brushing her hair, long and dark and newly unbound. Josie breathed deep. The air smelled like pine and wet bark and the sweet rot of old leaves. Her heart beat slow and certain. There was no sudden clarity, no storybook ending. Just this, she'd meant to stay one night. But the snow had fallen, and he hadn't asked her to leave. And now neither would she.